Hello, everyone. Matt the Lesser here, and we are back with episode 14, the ultimate final episode, at least for now, of our Terra Mystica fan factions basic strategy series. If this is somehow the first video you found, there are 13 videos that you have missed, but we are going one by one through each of the 14 base color fan factions currently in beta testing on Board Game Arena, soon to be released as an official expansion for our favorite board game, Terra Mystica. And we are talking about what these factions do, how to play them, some strategy, tips and tricks. And as I said, this is the last one, the one that I've been waiting for, that probably many of you have been waiting for. Today, we are talking about the goats, the Dynion Geifr. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correct. I think it's Welsh. Depicted as this mountain goat man, are one of the absolute coolest factions in the fan faction set, and one that has been fascinating to follow the discussion and the development around. When these guys were first released over a year ago now for the beta testing, they were unquestionably the weakest faction that we've ever seen in Terra Mystica. The first few months when they were out, they were absolutely awful. You could not play them. They were completely uncompetitive. However, they have since been buffed and now are squarely a competitive, if not one of the stronger of the fan factions. Super fun to play, really unique play style, and it's an elegant design because the tweaks to what make them special are minor in some ways, but have such profound impacts on the game and how they play. And so one of my favorite factions, and I'm really, really thrilled to be closing the series, at least the base color series, with the goats. I'm going to call them the goats. I always call them the goats. I can't pronounce Dynion Geifr, and I have no idea if I'm saying it right. Anyway, so we will be calling them the goats. And again, no animations, no frills, one take, basic strategy fan faction overview of the goats. All right, let's go. So the goats are our second gray faction, bookending all the way back to conspirators, which were episode 1, the other gray faction. And if you look at the goats board, some differences from the norm jump out at you right off the bat. So first of all, one of the most important defining features of the goats are their dwellings. So normal dwelling production, single worker, they do have an increased base production of 1 extra worker. However, their dwellings cost 2 workers and 2 coins. So this is a little bit like swarmlings, actually, who also have a 2 worker cost dwelling. But the 2 worker dwellings really define a lot for the goats. And if you think about how this works over the course of the game, they're going to generate 5 extra workers. It's only 5 because they start with 1 fewer. 5 extra workers from the space worker income over the course of the game. But if you want to build, call it your normal 14 or 15 structures, that's not generating enough extra workers for you to build your full complement of dwellings relative to a normal faction. So you have to find those workers elsewhere. We'll talk a little bit about how you do that. But the real true defining definition of the goats comes on a portion of the board that you probably rarely even look at, which is that over here on the right side of the production box is the power level indicator for the buildings. Every other faction in Terra Mystica gets 1 power value for dwellings, 2 power values for TPs and temples, and 3 power value for big buildings. The goats change this, and they get 2 power value for every single structure. And so this means that dwellings, all structures, but most importantly dwellings, count as 2 power value toward towns. They also automatically give 2 power value for leeches. There's no such thing as a free leech for the goats unless you happen to have exactly 1 capacity in your bowls. But all of your leeches, if someone upgrades next to your dwelling, are 2 for 1s. This has a really, really big impact on how much power they get, how many victory points they pay for that power, and how they play overall. So this dwelling row is, we always look at the production box first. The first thing you look at is really probably one of the most important things we're thinking about, the defining feature of the goats. Okay, as we go up the production box, TPs are normal cost, normal production. Temples, normal costs, do have the sometimes seen 5 power production for the second temple instead of a priest, but otherwise normal. Big buildings are normal cost, the cheap variety, 6 coins, and the stronghold produces 4 power. We'll talk about the stronghold power right now because it's super simple. They have 2 things. One is the stronghold has the same power as the sanctuary in that a town is able to be formed with only 3 structures. So this means that the goats, if they build both their stronghold and their sanctuary, which they often do, can build 2 towns that only require 3 structures. This is particularly nice with the 2 power value of their dwellings alongside a couple other things that they do that we'll get to. But this is a really cool feature of the goats, and it often leads them to be able to form 3 or even 4 towns in many games. They also, when they build their stronghold, immediately get a one-time bonus of 2 priests. And we'll talk about the importance of priests for ghosts in a second. It literally cannot be understated. In the Power Bowls, 5-7 factions, so pretty normal stuff there. One of the reasons the initial version of the goats was so underpowered was that they started with even less power in the bulls, and that was a big problem. Now they are sort of standard competitiveness for round 1 power actions. They do start, as we mentioned, with 1 fewer worker, but because of the extra base worker income, they end up starting with the normal complement of 6 workers and 15 coins before any bonus tile benefits. Have a step on earth, step on air, normal shipping, normal digging costs. And then we get to their book abilities, which are twofold. I will start with the second one, which is they start with the Fire 2 favor tile. And this is a bit of, in my opinion, an inelegant solution to a problem that comes up with the goats, which is that because all of their buildings only have 2 power value, if they didn't have, without Fire 2, the 3 structure benefit of both the sanctuary and the stronghold can't actually be used. Because if you have, as the goats, your power value is always just going to be equal to 2 times the number of structures that you have in your cluster. So if you have 3 structures in a cluster, it's only 6 power value, and there's no way for you to increase that. So to actually take advantage, you would have to have Fire 2. So this was actually one of the buffs that was given to the goats, was they just gave them Fire 2 at the beginning of the game, so they didn't have to worry about always having to take it, potentially missing out on it, not being able to take a different favor instead in order to take advantage of their 3 power structure benefits for both the sanctuary and the stronghold. So that's why they have Fire 2. But the more important one, and the other key defining feature of the goats alongside their dwellings and their structure values, is this priest conversion capability. So goats are able at any time as a free conversion to convert a priest into 2 workers and 2 coins, aka the cost of a dwelling. This is an extremely powerful conversion, and just really good, and something that when you play the goats, you want to maximize as much as possible. And so it's one of the reasons, actually, I think that they don't produce priests on the second temple, because they want to give them slightly fewer priests to offset the power of this conversion. But 2 workers and 2 coins is just a great many resources to be receiving for the goats, even for in exchange for just 1 priest, even with the increased cost of their dwellings, because those workers and coins can also be used for all of the other stuff that they might want to do, other buildings, digging, shipping, which are all normal costs. That stuff's not more expensive. It's just the dwellings that are more expensive. So with this conversion, if used frequently and efficiently, the goats can actually, despite these higher dwelling costs, generate a lot more resources over the course of the game than many factions. And this is one of the things that makes them, in their current iteration, one of the stronger fan factions. So let's keep all of that in mind, and let's talk about when might we want to play this faction, the goats. So color wheel matters. We say this every time. Gray on base map, loves brown and black as neighbors, lots of good leech. I would say leech and neighbors are relatively less important for the goats than for most other factions. They can be a bit isolationist and be successful, partially because upgrading doesn't actually help them make more towns. They can make a town with 4 dwellings, for example, right? So, we didn't mention this yet, but we talked about the 3 power structures. but dwellings are worth 2. That means 4 dwellings is a town. So you don't actually upgrading, especially early in the game. Usually you want to do it, but you don't necessarily have to. But if you're gonna have neighbors are still good, brown and black are good on base map, and then obviously we have discussed at length how bad green and gray are, particularly on base map. So as a gray faction, the goats really do not like to see any green faction, in particular that spot on the eastern continent where the green hex covers up the exit point of the gray hex is a particularly nasty thing to get hemmed in as the goats, or really any gray faction besides maybe the dwarves who can tunnel underneath. So pretty standard stuff there. On the bonus tiles, goats, as we talked about, need extra workers. Their dwellings cost more. They often like to advance their digging, and the main way for them to get extra workers are the big building tile, which, you know, every faction get extra workers off the big building tile, and also the priest, because as we talked about, priests and conversions are amazing for goats. So this is probably the most important tile that you want to see in the game as the goats. Now, can you play the goats without the priest tile? Yes, it's not such to the extent that I would say you like shy away from them or discount them by some extremely large number of points in an auction if the priest tile isn't there, because there are plenty of other ways to get priests, power actions, just producing them, towns, etc. But if the priest tile is in the game, definitely better for the goats. It's almost always the one you would want to take in round 1 if it's available to you. Factions sitting in front of the goats will often try to deny them, or I guess behind them and ahead of them in bonus tile selection order, behind them in seat order, often will try to deny them the priest because it is that good for them. So this is definitely the one thing you really want to see in the game. I honestly don't have anything that I would highlight on the bad side. There's no one tile that really other factions are going to take much better advantage of than the goats. So I just kind of left it blank. I think they're quite flexible when it comes to the bonus tiles overall, other than just really liking to see that priest tile in the game. They're also quite flexible on the track. They tend to be a little bit more of an up faction and then out, as opposed to a spread wide early faction. And that's just because of the expensive cost of their dwellings, that it just takes a lot of, and this is one of the reasons they like more workers in the game too, right? Is it's just harder for them to get more dwellings out early because of how many workers it costs to do so. So sometimes it's more efficient for them to up their production through other means, usually by upgrading to temples. And so they tend to like higher structures early in the game and not seeing dwellings and TPs in the early rounds. The other thing with the goats is TPs are, and we'll cover this more later, but TPs are not that good for them because they don't even give you the increased building value that every other faction gets, because you're already at 2 with the dwellings. And so with TPs, you really only want to build them when you run out of dwellings to build, when you need to just go through it to get to a temple, or ideally when you can score it. And so goats, like many other factions, but maybe even more so, really like to see that round 4 or round 5 TP round when they can spam 4, even 5 TPs in a single round, score a whole bunch of points off of them, because that's the main benefit they're getting out of the TPs, is just scoring them and sort of reloading their dwellings to be able to finish out the game. If you have a bunch of TP rounds early in the game, particularly round 2 or round 3, is the area I found it's like not good for the goats, because they don't want to build TPs yet. They might want to build 1 or 2 in round 1, but beyond that, they probably want to wait until they've like got all their dwellings out and then actually build their TPs. Not to mention having all those dwellings out creates more workers, which is really good for the goats too. So, but overall, pretty flexible on the track. Nothing here that I would say is like absolutely necessary. But if you can get it, bigger stuff early, smaller stuff late, that's going to be good for the goats. Okay, talk about the map. Pretty normal gray on base map here. E7, F6, I would say, are by far your preferred starting spots in most games. Really, the only exception is if you do get stuck in a gray-green matchup, and that's when you might want to consider some of these other spots. It just kind of depends on who else is in the game. Like if you've got blue or yellow in the game too, you might consider F1 or G1 over here in the west, because you might be able to get some neighbors. If not, or maybe if you've got black, H6 down and trying to just form another town down here in the south can work pretty well. All of these would be instead of F6 as your normal hex. You're going to start on E7 basically every game. In general, goats like to form towns, right? We talked about how 4 dwellings is a town. They can often get 3 or 4 towns because of their stronghold ability and these extra value on their buildings. So we do want to think about town spots, right? So it's the same ones you're used to seeing on base map, but often like F6 up through C5 is really nice. Something in the middle of here off E7, including some of these reds and greens, you can usually find one over here in the west, F1, sometimes with a bridge. This southern one with H6, I9, H8 area. And then you can even sometimes find a town, maybe if you don't have D7 or something, C5 up here to the north, or even this I3 to I6 stretch I've seen can be a good spot for like a 4th town for goats. So, as you're playing the goats, think about where am I going to found my towns and make sure you carve out space. Goats are, we talked about green, but they also don't like red in the game, just because they just don't like color neighbors, because the easier that they can just find spots to spread next to where they already are, that's the better they're going to do. They're not a faction who is really going to like increasing their shipping to 3 and kind of spraying all over the map, because you lose one of the big benefits of those 2 power dwellings, which is creating more towns and earlier towns. Okay, so that's the map. Let's move on to the openings. We've got a big slide here, and this is because the goats are quite flexible and can do a number of different openings that can be successful depending on the resources that they have and the tiles that they're facing in the game. So let's start with, on the left-hand side, the most basic of openings is just building 1 temple and 1 or 2 dwellings is usually the most you can do as the goats. Obviously to build dwellings, you will need spades, sometimes temp ship. If you start in the middle and you get that 1 red hex, then there's a gray across from that, so that's where the temp ship comes in. You'll see on all these openings I have the priest, just because of the value of those resources. View that priest in your head as 2 workers and 2 coins. Unless there's a cult reward, then sure, if there's a good cult reward, you can send it for a spade, for example, you can send it to a cult. But for the most part, view those priests as 2 workers and 2 coins, and that's just an amazing resource haul to get on a bonus tile. So if you can take that, you probably want to take it. But to do a temple and a dwelling or 2, right, you start with 6 workers, so that's naturally 1 temple and 1 dwelling. But if you get a priest or you get a worker's power action, you can get 2 more, or a priest power action. Actually, right, you would always take. That's something as the goat. Always take the priest power action before the worker's power action. It costs you 1 less power and gets you 2 extra coins. So like there's literally never a situation where you would want to take the worker's power action over the priest power action. Okay, I won't say that. There's probably some situation where the denial of the worker's action to somebody else might be valuable, but in general, it's strictly better for you, the priest power action. So anyways, if you take that, then you can have 8 workers. That would be enough if you can find 2 spades, double spade, for example, that you could actually go temple and 2 dwellings. And this is a good opening if it's a spade event or a dwelling event. If you can get double dig, you're only a 5/7 faction, but you do generate 2 leech right away off your dwelling. So even if you're in a late seat, you might be able to get double dig. And if you can do that and get 2 dwellings down in addition because you took the priest bonus tile, for example, that's a great opening for the goats. Double temple, also very, very viable for the goats. You know me, I'm a double temple guy. One of my favorite openings with the goats. It's not maybe quite as amazing as it could be because that second temple produces 5 power instead of a second priest. If 2 temples produced 2 priests, I would highly advocate as always do the double temple opening. I think because it's 5 power, these other ones become more reasonable because either way you're going to be producing a single priest for next round, which is great. You want to produce as many priests as possible as quickly as possible, but in round 1 there's really no way to get to producing 2, so you're just going to produce 1. But if you can open double temple, use that 5 power from the second temple to get double dig in round 2, you'll be off to the races with a good opening for goats. You would probably want to open double temple when there's a TP event or a temple event because you'd be scoring those twice. And similar approach here, your TPs and temples are the same cost as any other faction, so you would open this way is the same stuff you need for any other faction to open double temple, with the exception that, remember, priests are workers and coins. So if you get a priest bonus action and or a priest bonus tile, you convert those and get those 2 extra workers and 1 extra coin that that you need to get to the 8 coins and 16, 8 workers and 16 coins that you need to do double temple. As with all other factions, with the goats, if you take double temple, highly recommend at least 1, if not 2, economic favors. I would say with the goats, maybe even lean a little more than normal toward going 2 economic favors, and that's because if you do open double temple, you probably very soon afterwards in round 2 or round 3 want to upgrade one of those temples to a sanctuary, so that instead of producing 1 priest and 5 power off the 2 buildings, you're producing 2 priests, which is just strictly better for you, given, again, the value of priests to the goats. And therefore, when you upgrade to that sanctuary, you could take, for example, your copy of Earth 1. But if there's, a rush and you want to get it or something, like going 1 econ 1 scoring favor with that double temple is also totally valid. The sanctuary is also a very valid opening. It's very similar to double temple. You'll see I've got basically all of the same bonus tiles and power actions here. Because the resources is also very similar. It's 8 workers and 14 coins to 16 coins, so it's basically the same. The only difference would be you'd probably be more inclined to do this if you're on the big building scoring tile and or there's a big building scoring event, right? If you can score it, go sanctuary, you'll produce, from the 2 buildings, a priest and a worker instead of a priest and 5 power. Pretty similar. You can get 2 favor tiles same way. Maybe the only difference is you're slightly less set up to get up to that second temple, but it's actually, basically the same number of resources. So if you're going to score the sanctuary, go ahead and do that instead of doing double temple. It just depends on what the round is and what bonus tile you have. Then finally, the last opening for the goats is to open with a town. And there are 2 ways to open with a town. There is the 4 structure option and there is the 3 structure option. The 4 structure option for a town is very simple. It's 4 dwellings. So one of the biggest benefits of the goats, as we already mentioned, is that you can form a town with just 4 dwellings, which is quite easy. To form a 4-dwelling town as the goats on base map, we'll flip back for a second. Your best option is this F6 through C5 town. So as long as you don't have green or red in the game, or at least not in your way, all you need is 2 spades on E9 and D7. And you can also build C5. You have already the workers. It's 6 workers total to build those 3 dwellings. You have them. So if you can just get those 2 spades, you can build those 3 dwellings to form your 4-dwelling town. So that's actually quite easy. The trickiest part is just that you need the spades to be non-consecutive, unless you start on C5 with temp ship, but that would be weird. So usually you want to start in the middle. So to do that, you probably need the spade bonus tile. And then you also take single spade or double spade to get the other spade, and then you can build up and do that town. Theoretically, if you got enough leech, you could also do this with double dig in the center and then also a bridge, but that's, again, a lot more leech and a lot more power that you need to spend. So that 4-dwelling town on the east continent is the easiest way to do that. The other option for the town is you can actually do a 3-structure town with the stronghold, which is why I've got the stronghold scoring tile on here, because remember, the stronghold gives you back 2 priests immediately and also gives you the 3 structure power. So to do this one, you probably need double dig. But if you can get double dig, and you can either dig them or not build immediately, or if you can get the double dig after you've built the stronghold, in maybe a game where there's not a huge leech party going on, and so it's slower for folks to build up to be able to get double dig, you can actually use your initial 6 workers to build your stronghold. Then you're going to get 2 priests back from the stronghold, which equates to your 2 dwellings. If you can build all of that off of just one of your starting structures, then bam, you have a town. And that's, again, particularly good if you're on the big building scoring tile or there's a big building scoring event. Getting that and using the resources from the town to continue snowballing can be really, really strong. With that town, if you get a round 1 town, I think you have 2 options for which town tile you take. Number 1 would be the 2-key town. This is probably good if there aren't any other super culty factions in the game. Goats are not... get a ton of priests, but they want to convert most of them. So they're usually kind of in the middle of cultiness. But if you can get going and there's good cult rewards, maybe if it is a big building event, so you get a worker back right away. The 2 key town can be really strong. The other one, obviously, is just the priest town. That's just giving you resources back. We talked about how the priest power action is strictly better than the worker power action for the goats. In the same way, the priest town is strictly better than the worker town for the goats, because it's worth 2 more coins and 2 more points. So always take that priest town over the worker town as the goats. So if you can open with a town, especially that 4 dwelling town, a dwelling round, for example, or in a town round, and then take a priest town, maybe there's temples in round 2, and that's when you build up to your temples and start producing priests. Totally valid opening for the goats in general. I would say with the goats, what you're really aiming for in some order is by the end of like round 3 to have probably like sanctuary, temple, and as many dwellings as you can have on the board. And maybe you've formed at least 1 town, maybe even 2. If you have done that at the end of round 3, you are golden, and you'll be really well positioned for the rest of the game to build up your TPs, hopefully on a scoring event, to upgrade your digs, found another town or 2. If you can do all that, you should be in a really good position. But you have a couple different options of like, do you do the dwellings first? Do you do the big buildings first? Both can work as the goats. Okay, lots of openings, lots of options, but all kind of converging toward this same mid-game point is what I have mostly seen as successful for the goats. All right, so we've talked about the opening, even toward the mid-game a little bit. Just a few other things to keep in mind as the goats, things that are maybe not as intuitive in some cases because of the weird way that this faction works. So the first one is intuitive. We've mentioned it a million times, and I'm going to mention it again. Get as many priests as you can. The priest power action is almost never a bad move for you. The priest bonus tile is almost never a bad move for you. Upgrading to temples and sanctuaries that produce more priests are always going to be good for you because those just become resources that can do extra stuff. If you can go like double temple round 1, sanctuary round 2, get a couple other priest power actions, you'll generate so many resources off of doing that without even having to expand, that I've had games with the goats where I've advanced my digging before I built a single dwelling, because you're actually able to generate enough workers off of that. And that, if you can do it, is super, super efficient, works really well. So just get all the priests that you can. We talked about the TPs and the fact that they're even less valuable for the goats than for most factions, because at least for most factions, you lose the worker income, but you get that power value structure toward a town. Again, this doesn't help you for the goats. So in addition to not building them before you kind of have to, also, even in like round 1, really think about when you upgrade, because your dwellings already leech 2. One of the, sometimes, for example, in round 1, maybe you're in first seat, you think, oh, I want to upgrade with my first action, so that then when all these people who are around me upgrade, I get 2 power instead of 1, gets me more toward power action. There's no benefit for you as goats toward that upgrade. So if not doing it, and maybe, for example, taking a priest power action instead, doesn't give any power to your opponents that they might use toward actions, and you're able to delay those upgrades until later in the round 1, or honestly in any round, think about the timing and implications of that. The normal trade-off and benefit that you get just doesn't exist in the same way for goats, so really think about that. Also, all those leeches are 2-for-1s, which does mean every single one you're going to give up a victory point. Most factions will get at least a handful, if not a lot, of 1-for-0s throughout a game, and that's a lot of free resources that the goats are not getting. One of the issues with the early version of the goats is that everyone found they were just losing an insane number of victory points to leech that they weren't getting back. So, and the goats have so many other ways to generate good resources, particularly through these priest conversions, that in my experience, I am very, very hesitant to take leeches, even from the very beginning of the game, that are more than 2-for-1s for the goats, because it's either a 2-for-1, or if you have 2 structures, it's a 3-for-4 or 4-for-3, and then goes up from there in increments of 2. And I'm just not sure that it is efficient and necessary beyond 2-for-1s. 2-for-1s are great. Take them. You'll probably get a bunch of them over the course of the game, but just really be careful about those bigger ones. And unless you're getting some immediate benefit, like hey, it gives you enough to get double dig. I would just be cautious, because if you look back at the score sheet at the end of the game and you're like, I did so much stuff, how did I not score so many points? Well, you might see that you lost 15 points to leech, and that can hurt you when you actually have enough resources otherwise to do what you want. We mentioned that advancing digs, very good general approach for the goats. Highly recommend looking at this, especially if you've got your worker generation engine going up really good. And then we also talked about 3 or 4 towns. The goats, this is yet another faction, just like the goblins, like we discussed in the last episode, who have a really strong economy and no inherent scoring. So they do need to find ways to find points, but they do have a natural benefit and advantage relative to other factions toward forming towns earlier and founding more towns, so they can typically make up some of that lack of inherent scoring there. And then obviously, hopefully you hit the track, find some scoring favors and past tiles, and all the other normal ways that you convert resources to points, advancing digging, etc. We talked about cults, be really choosy about sending your priests to the cults. If you get a 3 spot that gives you a spade, absolutely, I think that's still worth doing. But the goats, in the mid game, doing some 2-step for, an extra couple of coins on Earth or something like that might not be worth it then versus just exchanging that priest. So I would say the cults, they can tend to be in the medium or just have a lot of variety based on play style. And then network, the goats can typically build 15 or 16 structures. But the reason I have them as medium plus and not as high is that because they often want to build towns, sometimes the extra resources they have to pour into digging out those hexes, as opposed to being more efficient and spreading, which just isn't as good for them, might actually decrease their network by 1 or 2. So can be very competitive on network, not hugely vulnerable to getting cut off unless green is in the game, but maybe not going to be quite as out there on network as like treasurers, for example, who are always going to build 16. So overall, I mentioned it earlier, I think that in their current iteration, they're actually one of the stronger fan factions. Maybe not the strongest, but quite powerful if played really well. And just take my word for it. If you haven't played them yet, they are so fun to play. I can't explain why. I think it's just founding towns, getting the double leech. The calculus is a little different. When you see that first 4-dwelling town, you're like, oh man, this is so cool. The artwork, I just love everything about this faction. I think some of the history too of them being so bad and everyone being like, I really want to figure out how these guys work, why they're good. And now that they've been buffed to where they're actual, but they still have a bit of that history. I just love them. Inner City Sumo is the guy who designed this faction, and I'm just so happy and thrilled that he did. And it just tweaks something on the faction board. Little tweak on the faction board, right? Make your dwellings worth 2 power. It just completely changes how you play as faction. So anyways, I hope you have as much fun playing them as I did. Please find me in the comments. Find me on Board Game Arena. Tell me how your games with the goats go. Tell me which of the plethora of opening options you pursued. Show me that game where you build 4 TPs in round 2 and it works, and I'm completely wrong with what I'm saying here about the TPs. But again, just really go have fun with these guys. And this is the last episode of the base factions. I'm very happy. I know it took me 6 months to get through them all, but happy that we're done in advance of Terra Mystica. So if you're coming to the con, hope these videos help. You want to play in the Fan Factions tournament, I will definitely see you there. I'm administering it, and I will be playing in it myself too. Very excited for that. And keep checking on YouTube as I complete games that are good examples of all of the fan factions that I stream live. I have been attaching those VODs to the faction videos so that you have once you watch this video, you have an example. So if the faction doesn't have one yet, it means I don't have a good example yet, but some of them, especially some of the older episodes, now have them. So if you haven't seen those yet, go back and look, check out the example games. And when the people have asked me about the Fire and Ice expansion factions, the fan factions for Fire and Ice, they currently are in the early stages of beta testing, and I'm pretty sure they're going to get some, especially in a couple cases, some pretty significant nerfs or buffs before they get finalized. So I do plan to do these overview videos for those factions, but I'm not sure the timing yet because I want to wait until they get a little bit closer to their final form. And candidly, that I've had the chance to play them a little more and understand them a a little bit more. So indefinite pause on the series until then, but I really hope that you have enjoyed the series and these videos. I absolutely love the fan factions. They have completely reinvigorated, my love, which never really went away, but like I've just really loved exploring new ground in Terra Mystica with all these. I hope all of you do the same as you dive into these factions. And again, please come find me, tell me how it's going. And until next time, I will see y'all later.